Hi everybody, I'm Sarcasm-himé, and I have been sewing for a really long time, since the early days of cosplay when we didn't have all those newfangled things like Warbla and YouTube tutorials. Since I've been sewing a really long time, I've learned a lot of really fun tips and tricks to help make your costumes that extra little bit better. So this panel is about taking your costume from good to great, and ways to improve the fit of your costume, to improve the finish and the overall look. And basically, a lot of those things are what judges are looking for when we're judging your costume in competitions. You know, somebody whose costume fits really well as opposed to just okay. You know, whether the costume is made out of fabric that really suits the design or doesn't. Those are the kind of factors that you want to think about when you're making your costume. So this presentation was put together by my friend Priscilla, aka Pencils and Pincushions, and myself. Please follow her on the social medias because she is super awesome. She does awesome things like African steampunk and really cool stuff like that. So, some things that well-made costumes have in common. So here's some very different but equally awesome costumes. And one thing you can see for all of them is that they fit really well, and the fabrics and colors suit the characters. So, doesn't matter what your costume is, there are certain things you need to do to make it look a little bit better, including proper supportive foundation layers, selecting the appropriate fabrics, and making sure everything is nicely finished. And there are a lot of different methods of finishing things, which I will talk about later in the presentation. And please, if you guys have questions, just So one of the most important things in cosplay is fit. You don't have to be skinny, you can be any size as long as your costume fits well. That is one of the things that drives me crazy when people say, oh, you know, if you're big, you can't cosplay. That's not true. It's just a little harder to get things to fit on a larger frame than it is on a thinner frame, unfortunately, but it is absolutely possible, and you can look equally awesome. So here are two ladies in a bell ball gown. You can see they've taken different approaches to the concept. One is wearing a more metallic fabric, one is wearing a satin fabric, but they both look fantastic because their dresses are well proportioned and fit really nicely. So what you really need to do before starting is figure out what you're doing. So you want to find some good, if you're doing recreation, you want to find some good reference pictures and do a breakdown of what you're going to be doing, all the elements, all the materials that you're going to need, what techniques you're going to need. Try to fit a lot of anime and video game characters. Their costumes don't exactly make sense or obey the laws of physics and gravity. So you're going to have to do some problem solving and sort of brainstorm some ideas of what am I going to use for this piece? What are some ideas of things? Who's calling me? No. Put it on Do Not Disturb. What the hell?
Please silence your cell phone.
I thought that was what Do Not Disturb means. Okay. So, as we were saying, you want to brainstorm some ideas of what you can use to make the different pieces. In some cases, you might have to try a couple of different techniques if the first one doesn't work out. But that's what I always make a sheet that I have a little binder that I print for all my costumes. I print out a sheet that has a couple reference pictures or as many reference pictures as I need to show all the details of the costume. And then I have a point form list of all the things that all the materials I'm gonna need, any ideas of how I'm going to make something, basically a shopping list, so that when I'm out shopping, I can just pull that book out, I can compare the colors and make sure I have everything. So yeah, helps you track down what you already have versus what you need to make you buy, what patterns you need, fabrics, and figuring out what techniques you're going to need to learn. So another really important thing about planning before you start is how are you going to get the thing to the con? This is really critical and needs to be done at the beginning, because there's nothing worse than building something giant and then they're like, this does not fit in my car. This doesn't fit on a plane. What do I do now? So you want to avoid that issue and figure it out in the planning stage. And also, planning, you want to think about where you're wearing this, what is the context. There are some decisions you're going to make differently depending if the costume is going to be seen up close or from 100 feet away. So like some things, if you're going to be presenting it on stage, you might need to bump up your details, increase the contrast, add some piping lines or something so that the details of your costume are going to be able to be seen from the audience. Whereas if you're doing something for a close-up photo shoot, you might go much finer on the details because you know that the photo is going to be able to catch all those details. So those are the things you want to think about, like where are you wearing it and what is important to be seen. So good fit starts with good patterns. Commercial patterns are really, really great as a starting point. Do not be discouraged if your pattern does not fit. Patterns are made based on a sort of standard-sized human that isn't actually any human. So most commercial patterns don't fit anyone perfectly. They all require a whole lot of modification. In fact, a lot of commercial patterns have a ridiculous amount of ease. That's basically extra space they add so that you can move your body. And ease is important so that you don't rip seams every time you lift your arm. But a lot of commercial patterns add a lot of ease, especially at armholes and things like that. So you may find that the commercial pattern is fitting really, really weirdly when you first make your mock-up. That is normal. Do not be discouraged. It will probably take you a while. Also, commercial patterns, the size on the envelope is not your clothing size. This is another thing that a lot of people don't realize when they're first starting out. Go by the measurements on the back of the envelope. Measure yourself and compare the measurements because pattern sizes are completely different from clothing sizes. So here's an example. This shows the finished garment measurements. So you want to basically measure yourself and then see what's going to fit inside those measurements. So there's a lot more of selection for women's patterns than for men's patterns, but it is getting better, especially since a lot of pattern companies have finally included to the fact that cosplay is a thing. And so they're now offering a lot more costume-focused patterns for both men and women. If you want to be able to reuse your patterns for different sizes, you can trace them instead of cutting them out. And you can trace them onto a more durable paper because the pattern tissue is very, very fragile and it's hard to reuse. So if you have a pattern that you're going to want to use over and over, you want to trace it onto some kind of paper, a cheap paper that's going to be a little more durable. An alternate to commercial patterns, draping and drafting. They're very different methods but equally valid. So flat pattern drafting involves taking measurements and using math to figure. Oh my God, what the hell? I'm so sorry. With flat pattern drafting involves taking measurements and basically drawing out the pattern on flat paper using those measurements. Which one you want to use is really a personal decision. Everybody's brain works differently. Personally, I find draping way easier, but other people really, really prefer flat pattern drafting. Like, if you like math, the flat version is for you. And that's the method that they will usually teach you in fashion school. It basically, I don't, no. Yes, please. I don't, somebody is apparently trying to get in my front door in Canada. I don't know. So So flat pattern drafting, it's easier to do if you don't have a mannequin to drape things on, but it has a bit of a learning curve. Well, we don't have the draping. So yeah, draping involves putting it on a mannequin and basically pinning your fabric onto a mannequin and then drawing the seams on. That one works better if you're a very visual learner and like to see what it's actually going to physically look like on the thing. But you need a mannequin to do it. Or, I mean, you can do it by pinning things on yourself and drawing awkwardly on yourself. I have done that many times. It is a thing you can do, it's just not as easy as if you have a mannequin. So once you've created your patterns, you have to use a mock-up. Please use a mock-up. You can use any kind of fabric as long as the drape is similar to your final garment. So you can use bed sheets, you can use curtains, anything cheap. If you're going to be making something out of spandex, ideally you want to make your mock-up out of something that also has a stretch, but get like the cheapest spandex you can possibly find for your mock-up. So, oh wow, so, okay, this, yeah, it's not always gonna fit the first time. So here are some examples of fitting problems. And we've got bust too tight, bust too loose, sleeves too loose, and sleeves too tight. Then you can see the lines, or the wrinkle lines are showing you where things are either pulling or wrinkling. And so here's some more problems of pants too tight or pants too loose. And so what you want to do if things are not fitting is look in the mirror and see where the stress lines, where the wrinkles are, and take notes of where it needs to be fixed. So in this example, with the bust is too tight, what they're doing with the flat pattern is what you call slash and spread, where you're going to cut into the pattern at the areas where it's too tight, open up the pattern, and fill it in with extra paper to give yourself more space. Similarly with the sleeve, where the sleeve is too tight, they've cut a line down the middle and opened it up to add more space. Same with the pants here. And for if it's too loose, you basically do exactly the same thing, except instead of opening it up, you're going to close it up and take away some of the space. And it can take multiple mock-ups to get things to fit right. So ideally, you don't want to be con crunching, but all of us con crunch. So moving on to fabric. Fabric choice is super important for having a really, really high quality costume. Color is not the only thing you want to look at when you're shopping for fabric for your costumes. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it has to work for the design. So does it have the right weight, which is like how it hangs and how lightweight and fluffy it is, or heavy? Does it have a shine or no shine? Is it stiff or flowy? Does it have any kind of texture? How does it photograph and look in lighting? Those are also super important because some fabrics look completely different indoors and outdoors and in different lighting. And some fabrics photograph really weirdly. Some fabrics look weird under flash. Like some fabrics turn transparent under flash or stage lighting. So you want, if these are things, you want to have these things in mind. If you're concerned about how fabrics is going to look in different lighting, a lot of purples look very differently under different lighting and in photos. So you can, ask the fabric store if you can take the fabric and look at it under natural light, just to check that the fabric isn't going to look weirdly different in different lighting situations. So here are some examples of different burgundies, but because these fabrics all have a very different weight and sheen and texture, they're all going to look very different on your costume. And a lot of, when you're, especially if you're shopping for fabric online, which a lot of us do because it's convenient and cheap, a lot of stores will show their fabrics swatches like this, kind of swirled up. And what that does is tell you how the fabric behaves. So if we go back, you can see the swirls look very different. Some are kind of, have sharp angles, and some are soft.
I figured it out, we're fine.
Okay. So the soft swirls, that's going to be a drapey fabric, and the ones that have sharp angles are more stiff fabric. So stretchy fabrics. If you're using a pattern that requires stretch fabrics, you need to use stretch fabric. There are two different kinds of stretch fabric. There's two-way versus four-way. Two-way only stretches in one direction, even though it's called two-way. Four-way stretches in all directions. So you can get away with, say, making a bodysuit out of a two-way stretch, but you need to make the stretch go around your body so you can, breathe. However, if you use a two-way stretch to make it like a full bodysuit, you may not be able to bend over. Stretching seams, there's a few different ways to sew the seams. Either use a super narrow zigzag, or if you see at the top there's a lightning bolt stitch. If your machine can do that, it is super great for stretch fabrics. It is the worst to seam rip, just a heads up. So be warned, you want to avoid seam ripping that if at all possible. If you find that your stretch fabrics are getting sucked down into the feed jogs under the needle, that can happen. Use some tissue paper or a tearaway stabilizer. A few things are getting cut off at the bottom, I think, because this was made for PowerPoint and we're not using PowerPoint, but we'll manage. So when you're cutting your fabric, make sure your fabric is on the grain. Your pattern will have arrows showing the grain of the fabric. That means the direction that it was woven. Most patterns you're going to want to cut them straight on the grain. Some patterns you're going to cut it on the bias, which is diagonal, and that allows for stretch, a little bit of stretch and drape. So most patterns have a cutting layout diagram that's going to give you the most efficient way to cut your fabric and have everything on the correct grain. For example here. And one thing, you're not always going to have to think about it, but especially on things that fit very, very tightly, like corsets, turn of cloth. So what that means is that the fabric, when it's going into a seam, it's folding around itself, and that fold takes up a little bit of fabric. It may only be a millimeter, but if it's something like a corset that has to fit really, really tightly, those millimeters can add up. So in some cases, if your fabric is kind of thick, you may need to add an extra millimeter or two to the seams to account for that so that you don't end up with a corset that is too small. So support and foundation layers. These are super important to make something look good. Lining is not just, like when people think lining usually, you think of, like, say, inside a suit jacket. That slippery stuff that hides all the guts of the jacket. That is one way of lining, but it's not the only way of lining. So that type of lining is called bag lining, and it's basically just there to finish the inside and make it look nice. Another way of lining is flat lining, which is more structural and supportive. So bag lining is usually a lightweight, slippery fabric, polyester acetate or silk, some lightweight cotton fabrics. Here are some different kinds of linings. And these are the kinds of ones that you want to do if you're lining a garment that is going to be worn over something else and you want it to be able to move freely. And if the inside is going to be seen and you want the inside to look nice. So underlining, also known as flat lining, gives extra stability and strength to your fabric. Basically, what you're doing is cutting the lining fabric the same as the outer fabric, putting them together and treating them as one. So they are together during the construction of the garment. So I like to use flat lining and underlining for supporting fabrics when the outer fabric is a little bit flimsy and you want it to not look so flimsy. So I'll use like a cotton broadcloth or a twill under a more flimsy fabric to give it more body. And in here, you can even add a little bit of something soft to cushion and prevent the layers underneath from showing. So here's an example of a bodice where you can see the dotted fabric is the outer fashion fabric, and then it's flat-lined with the white fabric, and the white lines are the boning that has been sewn only onto the seam allowances, so they're not going to show through. And then there's a waist tape, a waist stay sewn to the seam allowances as well, and that basically keeps the bodice from riding up. So here's an example of building a strapless garment where they've made an understructure that has all of the support built into it. So it has the waist tape, it has the boning onto the underlayer, and then it has an outer layer that basically is just decorative. So if you're building a ball gown or some kind of strapless top and you don't want to have boning lines or any support showing, this is one way you can do it. So yeah, here we have the go back. So underlining, for building structure into garments, I like to, like I said, I like to use a lot of cotton broadcloth, but if you are underlining something that needs to be big and poofy, silk organza is basically the best. It is not cheap, but it is the best. If you need to make big poofy sleeves, you can underline it with silk organza and it's going to really, really hold its body. So yeah, this method was basically universally used in bodice construction, like Victorian bodice construction. Here's another example where you can see the underlining and then the boning attached to the seam allowances, and then the bottom is facing that's been tacked onto the lining only. And so some people think that having exposed seams like this is like unfinished or unprofessional. Absolutely not. This is 100% legit. This is basically how historical garments were constructed because you wanted to be able to alter them. So interfacing, there are different kinds of interfacing. There's fusible, non-fusible, woven, non-woven. The non-woven ones are the ones that kind of just look like little threads kind of pressed together. Get the best interfacing you can afford. I would avoid the really, really cheap stuff because it's not going to stay. Especially the fusible, avoid super, super cheap fusible interfacing because you'll be sad and you will regret your life. Hair canvas is used in a lot of men's suit jackets. That's what supports the front of the jacket to make it nice and smooth and stiff. So if you're making any kind of school uniform or any kind of suit jacket for your cosplay, I recommend putting a panel of hair canvas or buckram into the front of the jacket so it'll stay smooth. So stabilizers are used temporarily, whereas interfacing is meant to go into the garment permanently. So stabilizers are good if you're doing any kind of detail, embroidery, or if you're working with really, really slippery fabrics that don't want to behave themselves. You can use a wash away or a tear away stabilizer just while you're sewing and then remove it afterwards. Like one of the most horrible fabrics I've ever worked with was a satin organza, which basically would not go straight through my machine. It was like snot. So I had to use tear away stabilizer on both sides of the seam. Otherwise, just like all over the place. Boning, not just for corsets. So basically, anytime you have a bodice that needs to stay up without straps, or really any bodice that is tightly fitting. Any garment that is tightly fitting, you want to have some kind of boning in it. It's not to like make your waist small. It is to, what boning does is it keeps the garment from crumpling. Excuse me. So how corsets work is that the fabric, the shaping of the seams is going to give you shape. The boning basically just keeps the fabric from collapsing. So any kind of tight-fitting garment, you want some kind of, something rigid, like plastic, metal, doesn't matter, that's going to keep the fabric from collapsing, especially anywhere where there's lacing. So here's some examples of different boning types. Ridgeline is the one that you'll often find at like fabric stores, Joann's. It's comprised of tiny little rods of plastic inside a synthetic ribbon. It is really weak. It's not good for a lot of things. I would only use it for very, very light support of a bodice that you're wearing on top of a corset. Spiral steel, for other types of boning are spiral steel, which is basically like a spring that's been flattened. Spring steel, which is a piece of flat metal that springs back to its shape, hence the name. There's also plastic, like high quality plastic boning that you can get, such as German plastic and artificial whalebone. Those are really, really good. In a pinch, you can also use industrial size zip ties. Not the little thin ones, but like the heavy duty zip ties. You can use those for boning and they are pretty cheap. And different ways to apply it. The little metal tips are usually used for the spiral steel to finish off the sharp edges. You can use shrink tubing. You can also use plasti dip, like the dippy kind, not the spray kind. If you are interested in getting into corsetry or learning more about boning types and all of that, I highly recommend going to the Farthingale's website. They are the sort of North American corset supply place. And it's Farthingale's. So where do you want to put your bones? It depends on how much support you need. So here at the top we have somebody that doesn't need a whole lot of support because she doesn't have big boobs. At the bottom one, need a bit more support, so more bones. Tapes. Tape is any kind of woven strip of fabric. Twill tape is really, really good as supporting areas that might stretch. If you buy sweaters, they might have a tape sewn into the shoulder so that it doesn't stretch, and also necklines. And for strapless bodices, you often want to put a waist tape at the exact waist to keep it from riding up as you move. One thing I should talk about before we move on is I would not recommend using bias tape if you're making corset channels, because bias tape stretches and it's not as strong as twill tape. So use twill tape or something like a grosgrain if you're going to make the boning casings for corsets. So moving on to making things fluffy, there's a bunch of different kinds of fluffy netting. There's everything from tulle, which is very, very soft, to petticoat netting, which is extremely stiff and scratchy. So you basically choose the one that's going to give you the support that you need for your giant skirt or whatever it is you're making. You can get a lot of volume with tulle, but you need like a billion yards of it. Like I think there's a TV show where they make the like ridiculous giant wedding dresses that are like 5,000 yards of tulle or something. I would advise against that. Just horsehair braid is super great for stiffening hems. But basically anything that you need to not collapse. And it's also used in hat making. So it's not made of horsehair anymore, it's basically nylon. But it's quite stiff, it comes in all different thicknesses. It can be, at the fabric store you can usually get it like about yay wide, but it also comes in, it's possible to get it like 60 inches wide if you need to make a giant stiff skirt. Here's an example of before and after using horsehair braid. So this is how you get those big, swoopy hems. So how you insert it. You're gonna, because the edge of the horsehair is stretchy, you want to wrap it in a little piece of ribbon or something, sew that together, sew it to the garment, and then turn it around to the inside and stitch by hand onto the inside of the garment. Hoop skirts. You need the right shape for your garment. So you don't have to have the highest quality hoop skirt, but it needs to be strong enough to hold up to your fabric. If you have a very, very heavy skirt, you're gonna need a stronger hoop skirt. And make sure it has enough hoops. So you can see we have a kind of derpy looking skirt there, where you can clearly see the shape of the hoops versus a much nicer silhouette. You always want to wear petticoats on top of your hoop skirt to hide the shape of the hoops, because it doesn't look as nice if you can clearly see the lines of the hoops through your skirt. And you want to have enough hoops. This Amazon monstrosity is not going to give you a nice result. And the one on the right, the bonus is you can't get your foot caught in that because it's solid at the bottom. So, sewing. Always test your fabric, your needle, your thread, and your fabric before you start, because every fabric behaves differently. Combinations of needles, threads, and fabrics are always different, so you probably need to tweak with your tension and your settings. Don't yank the fabric through your machine, because that way is good. You're gonna mess up the timing of your machine, and you might break your needles. But I can't see ahead. I like to hold my fabric taut as it goes through the machine. So if you find, well, we're going to cover this in a sec. So press your seams as you go. Please press your seams, please. Yes, it's important. Sewing machine feet can be addictive because there are so many of them and they are super useful. Some of my faves, ruffler feet on the top left. It's really good if you need to make a lot of ruffles and you're not trying to ruffle X length into specifically Y length. If you just need to make a lot of ruffles, that is a great foot to have. Caveat, it has a lot of moving parts and a lot of things can go wrong. You probably will end up with a needle flying at your face. Please wear eye protection. Roll hem feet, super great for finishing off fine fabrics like chiffons. You kind of need to babysit them a little, but they're really useful. Zipper feet, two different kinds. If you spend your money on only one specialty sewing machine foot, get the walking foot. It is the best. Because what it does is your sewing machine has the grips at the bottom, which grabs the fabric and move it along, and then your presser foot is usually smooth. And so if you find that when you're sewing long hems or seams, that it's twisting slightly and you're getting weird diagonal puckers on your hem, it's because the feed dogs at the bottom are dragging the fabric faster than the top layer of fabric is moving. So the walking foot has little grips on the top, and it grabs the fabric at the same speed as the feed dogs. So the fabric, the two layers of fabric are going to be moving exactly the same time, and you're not going to get those weird pulls and diagonal puckering. I basically almost never take my walking foot off my machine unless I'm using like a zipper foot. That's the only time. So difficult fabrics, if you're using chiffons, slippery fabric, satins, stitched with tissue paper or tearaway stabilizer. Chiffon, you can stabilize it with unflavored gelatin. This is a super great trick. Just dissolve some unflavored gelatin into hot water, let it sit, dunk your chiffon into it for like half an hour, let it dry, and your chiffon will no longer be super flowy and difficult to cut straight. Once you're done cutting it and sewing it, just rinse out the gelatin. So yeah, it's magic. It's amazing. Because chiffon is the worst. Sequins and beaded fabrics, do not stitch over sequins and beads, please. You will mess up your machine. Remove the sequins and beads from the seam allowance, sew your seams, and then you're gonna have to stitch the sequins and beads back on little bald areas afterwards. It takes time, but it avoids you breaking needles, having things fly at your face, or messing up your machine. For vinyl and PVC sticky fabrics like that, you can either put some Scotch tape on your presser foot or get a Teflon foot and use a longer stitch length. And for fur, you want to hand base your seams and use a longer stitch length, and you also want to comb the fur away from the seam allowance so that it's not getting caught in the seam allowance. And you can also carefully shave some of the fur away from the seam allowance, but don't shave too much because you don't want bald areas. So here we've got Some examples on the bottom, we've got some hand-basted fur there. And on the middle, that's the tape on the presser foot. Here we go. So if you find that your seams, especially long vertical seams, pucker, a lot of it can be due to the way that the machine feeds the fabric in through. The tension isn't always right. So what I like to do is hold my fabric taut with one hand behind the presser foot and one hand in front, and just hold the fabric taut and then allow it to naturally feed through. I don't force it, I just allow it to naturally feed through, and holding it taut massively reduces the amount of puckers and wrinkles. And another issue, especially if you're doing long vertical seams, the selvage, which is the very edge of the fabric where it was manufactured, often tends to be woven tighter than the rest of the fabric because that's where it was on the machine, on the loom. So try to avoid sewing right next to the selvage because since it's tighter, you're gonna get puckers. So I like to cut a little bit away from the selvage. Closures, you have a lot of different options. Invisible zippers they look the nicest, but they are weak. So I would not use them anywhere where you need, where it's gonna be under tension because it will break. So if it needs to be something that's sturdy, use a regular zipper and have either centered or lapped. If you're gonna be doing lacing, you need to have boning next to the lacing holes. As you can see here, there's boning on either side of those lacing holes to keep the tension of the lacing from pulling the garment and collapsing it. And if you're doing lacing for things that are going to be under high tension, like a corset or armor that's going to be laced on your body, I recommend using two-part grommets, not eyelets. The eyelets are the ones that are just one part. They are weak, they will shred your thread, and they will pop out. Get the two-part ones, the ones you need to set with a hammer, or there's also some special pliers you can get to set those. Those are going to be the ones that are sturdy, they won't pop out of your fabric, and they won't shred your cord. I need to put a thing on here about giant snaps. Giant snaps are the best. You can use Velcro. Velcro's okay, but giant snaps are better. Little snaps are useless. Get the big ass ones. Like if you need to attach anything to your costume, big snaps are your friend. Especially like weird armor pieces and little decorations that need to just like magically float on your costume. Sew a giant snap onto it, glue the other side of the snap onto your piece, snap, done, you can take it off to wash it. So here's one example of how to make an invisible closure. This was done a lot in Victorian and Edwardian bodices where they have a hidden center front opening and then flaps that close over top and attached with tiny hooks and eyes. So in this one, they've got a center front and then we've got the flap that closes over from the right side onto the left side of the bodice with tiny hooks and eyes, so it looks like there is no closure. So a lot of those anime designs that have no visible closures, you can figure something like this out so that it looks like just magic. So your seam finish options, you have a lot of it depends on what your fabric is. So if your fabric is super fray prone and kind of lightweight, French seam might be your friend. You can also do a flat fell seam, so that's both of those are going to completely enclose the raw edges so it cannot fray. French seams are best on straight seams. It's harder to do on curve. It's possible, but it's harder. Zigzag is good for something that isn't going to fray too badly, but you still need to finish it a little bit. Pinking is good for fabrics that don't really fray that much or heavier fabrics. Turn stitch, what they're doing is they're just taking the seam allowance, turning under a little bit, and stitching the seam allowance by itself. And then of course there's, if you want to be fancy, you can bind the seam with bias tape for a Hong Kong finish. There's also, of course, serging if you have a serger. Serging is not required. It is, you don't have to have a serger to be a good cosplayer. As long as you finish it in some way so there's not loose threads hanging everywhere, that is totally fine. And in fact, most haute couture gowns and outfits are hand finished for all the seam allowances. They're not serged, they're like whip stitched usually by hand. So here we have some hems. We've got a turn and stitch, which is, as it says, you just turn it under and top stitch. Facing is good if you don't want a lot of stitching visible on the surface. So you stitch the facing to the fashion fabric, hold it under, and then use tiny invisible stitches to attach the facing to the outer fabric. That's also a good thing to do if you cut your skirt too short and you don't have enough to make a good hem. You can just attach a facing, and then that gives you a little extra room. Blind hem is similar in that you're taking tiny, tiny little stitches that only take like 1 or 2 threads on the surface, so it's almost invisible. And rolled hem is really good for fine fabrics and lightweight shears. So facings, the layout is that. So you can use them both lined and unlined. If you're going to do a facing, you want to get the shape before you sew the garment up, because you're using the shape of the pattern piece. So you can use it to finish hems, armholes, necklines. So here we have a combination neckline and armhole facing. So there's not going to be stitching showing on the outside. And here is facing to finish the front edges of a historical bodice. You can see it at the bottom edge. And in that case, the facing is being sewn to the lining, so no stitches at all are going to be visible on the surface. Piping is one of my very favorite things. It is the greatest. So, especially for anime and game costumes, I love seeing piping used as outlines, because it really kind of replicates that cel-shaded look. You know, like it outlines the details, especially if you have a lot of bright colors. You have a nice black outline, it looks really cool. Especially if you're going to be seen on stage, it makes the details and outlines of your costume really pop. So you can make piping out of anything. You can buy pre-made piping from the fabric store. You can also make your own. All you need is bias strips of your fabric and a cord. It can be any cord. So you can make super thick piping or super, super tiny baby piping. It's probably cut off here, but you can also do stretch piping. So if you want to pipe seams or details on your superhero costume, you can use strips of spandex wrapped around elastic cord to make stretchy details on your costume. So, hand stitching. Some people love it, some people hate it. It does take practice, but if you can get the hang of doing some basic hand stitches, your sewing will improve, because there are always some things that are going to be annoying to do on the machine or impossible. So, like sometimes you need to get into super tiny areas, and it's just wrestling it through the machine is going to be a nightmare. Also, sewing embellishments and trims onto some fabrics, it can be really hard to get the tension right so it doesn't pucker the fabric. So if I need to put a lot of trim on a skirt, I will often hand sew it just so that I get the tension right, and it's not going to be the thickness of the trim meeting the fabric isn't going to cause problems with the tension and make it look weird. So here's some different hand stitches. The slip stitch is good. It's also called ladder stitch, where it's going sort of like, it's like a ladder, it's going in and out, in and out. Running stitch is a basic construction stitch, just in and out. Whip stitch is good for quickly attaching bindings or finishing edges by hand. And back stitch is the strongest stitch. Basically, you're creating a loop inside the fabric. And it's strong because since you're making a loop, it's a little bit stretchy. So it's not going to break as easily. So anywhere that you're doing a hand stitch that you want it to be strong, you should do a back stitch. 14. So embellishment should be the icing on the cake. Ideally, you want to have your costume constructed well before you add the embellishment. You don't want to throw a whole lot of fancy stuff on a costume that doesn't fit, because it's going to detract from all the work you did on the embellishment. And there isn't one correct way to do embellishment for costumes. I sometimes see people sit, thinking that embroidery is the only way to like win an award, or it's the only correct way. That is absolutely nonsense. A lot of it is down to what you can do personally, what you're confident about, what the design, what suits the design. So it's a lot of making good decisions, doing experiments, doing tests, and figuring out what's going to work for the thing that I'm making and what is within my skill set. So always do tests, always practice. Applique is a very popular option. It can look super, super nice, and there are different ways of doing it. Whoops, go back. So you can do machine applique, where you can use stabilizer or iron-on adhesive to glue your applique down and then satin stitch around the edge. You can also, if you're doing appliques with synthetic fabrics, you can cut the applique out using a hot knife, which will seal the edges of the synthetic fabric and keep it from fraying. And in that case, you can often just do a super, super tiny top stitch around the edge of the applique, and you don't need to satin stitch it, because that can take forever. I've also sealed the edges of appliques using fabric paint. That works really well, and you can do a really, really fine outline of paint to keep the edge from fraying. Hand applique, you basically fold the edges under and do tiny stitches to attach it. That can be best if you need your applique to be flowy as opposed to more stiff. So machine applique tends to be a bit stiffer. If you need very, very soft applique pieces, you might want to do either hand applique, or there's other options you can look into, like doing silk painting, or like there's a liquid fabric paint, which remains fairly soft. So lace, there's lots of different types of lace. Buy the best lace you can afford, as with the interfacing. Really, really cheap scratchy laces are going to look cheap and scratchy, and they will be uncomfortable. But you don't have to spend $1 million on lace. You can dye lace if you can't find the right color. If it's synthetic, you may need to use polyester dyes, but most of them can be dyed. If you can't find the exact motifs that you need, you can cut lace apart and Frankenstein it together to make motifs. And you can also fabric paint lace if you need a specific color or texture. And if you're making a garment out of lace and you want a seamless look, you can basically overlap the areas, hand stitch around motifs, and then cut, and then carefully trim away the excess so it looks like all one piece and you don't have a straight line. Excuse me. So, transferring patterns for embellishment, a lot of it is what kind of fabric you're working on, what kind of embellishment you're doing. If it's a thin fabric, if it's a light colored fabric, you can often just put your design behind it and trace on a pencil or a wash away marker, or one of the markers that disappear after time. You can also use carbon paper. There's special sewing carbon paper that you can trace your design onto the fabric. And there's also the chalk pencils that you can use to trace your pattern onto your fabric. And here there's this really historical method, which is the pouncing, where you have your pattern, you prick tiny little holes into the paper pattern, and then you use some kind of powder. In this case, I think it's carbon powder, but you can also use chalk to push the powder through the holes onto your So, putting a costume together. Here's an example. It is the design that we're going to be making. Is a sort of layout of the basic shape, figuring out what the back is going to look like, because a lot of time you may not have a reference image of the back. I had to deal with that with this costume I'm wearing now. There was only a front view. I had no idea what the back looked like, so I have to come up with something, use your imagination. So here, you're breaking down, purchase and commission portions, maybe like, what can I make? What is realistic for me to make? What do I have time to make? How much budget do I have? I'm gonna buy the wig, I'm gonna buy a hoop crinoline because I could make it, but I kinda don't want to. And then, what am I gonna make? Okay, I need a strapless sweetheart neckline bodice. What kind of fabrics am I gonna use? You could use low sheen satin, a taffeta, a cotton sateen. What am I need? I need some kind of underlining and a lining fabric. I'm gonna need boning. I'll need the grosgrain for the boning channels, some lace appliques, what kind of closure, and looking at pattern possibilities. So a lot of cosplay, you're gonna need to Frankenstein your patterns. So you'll often have a few different pattern options and then put them together to create the final garment. And here, how the sleeves are gonna come together, and how are you gonna make the underskirt? How are you gonna do those gold appliques? Because in this case, there could be many different ways of doing it. You could make them, you could purchase them, do a machine applique, something to support the hem, and the lace, buy it, make it, etc. So here, there's a list of things to learn, things to practice before doing the final garment. And here, there were supposed to be some pictures of people's beautiful Princess Garnet costumes, but apparently this program does not like PowerPoint. So here we have an example of a real version of the type of bodice we saw earlier, with the understructure on the lining layer, and you can see the waist tape, the boning, and you can see the seam allowances have been tacked down in sort of a hand zigzag to the lining only. It's not going to show up on the other side, and on the right side you don't see any of the construction details. Oh, here we go. So here are two different versions of this dress. And you can see they both had sort of different approaches for the embellishment at the bottom, but they both look pretty. Here's this that I'm wearing today. So here you can see my breakdown of that's my cosplay breakdown sheet, where I did a little sketch at the bottom to figure out what I was going to do for the back and how I thought it might work out. And then I have a list of all the things that I need to buy or make, etc. And then on the right, you can see my progress, where I figured out that I needed to get the shape of the skirt right. And the way I did it is I built basically a skirt out of poster board, so I could get the scale right, and then I could check the printout that I'd made of the cage to make sure that it was the right scale. And so I had to tweak that a bit. Then I built the cage out of foam rods and Warbler, and here in the middle you can see testing the overskirt to make sure that it fits correctly on that big paper skirt. I've got the lace pieces that I cut out individually and painted, and then pinned onto the bodice so I could hand sew them onto the bodice. And then on the bottom, you can see, and I can show you guys later if you want to look at my skirt. The hoop, there's a hoop in the back which attaches to the cage in the front. It attaches with giant snaps, because giant snaps are the best. And the hoop hides under the outer skirt. And so that took some engineering to figure out how I was going to do that, because usually if you have a half hoop, it's not going to stay out, but the cage holds it out in front. So there's the finished costume. Yeah. So in conclusion, do a breakdown, plan ahead and budget time for learning new techniques, ideally. I know con crunch is always a thing. But try to avoid learning something new at the last minute. I don't always take my own advice. I have a bad habit of leaving the engineering problem until the last minute because I don't want to deal with it and I procrastinate, and then sometimes I roll a critical one. So yeah, don't follow my example. Fitting is super, super important, but it takes a while to master, so don't give up. It looks terrible initially. Keep trying, you will get it eventually. If you need to get a friend to help you fit, do that, absolutely. A lot of the ways I fit things is I will make mock-ups and then just draw on the mock-up on myself. Take it off, mess with it, put it back on, draw on it again. It takes a while. Mock-ups are your friend. Fabric choice matters. Weight, color, drape, hold the fabric up, see how it moves. Hidden supports are your secret weapon and your best friend. And finishing touches, add an extra polish. Don't be afraid to hand sew. Thank you very much. Please, any questions? Like, yell out questions at me. If you have any problems that you need solving. Yes?
So I worked at a Joann's over the summer, which was like the best thing for a cosplayer to do ever. But I learned about a lot of new things, and one of them was they have in the interfacing section this pattern drafting paper.
Yeah.
Have like kind of like a paper, kind of like a fabric. Have you ever used it?
I haven't used that one, but I have a McCall's fitting pattern. I don't know if they still make those. They do?
Yeah, well, it's butter right, but they make them.
Yeah, so it's basically, it's a basic dress pattern that has a grid on it, and it has a bunch of sizes, and it's made out of that sort of papery, fabric-y stuff. And it's good for fitting to yourself until you have a base pattern that fits you, and then you can use that as a jumping off point for building anything else. So a lot of the times I won't even bother buying a commercial pattern if it's something that I can use that my dress block that already fits me to build off of. So, I don't have to start from scratch with every pattern. Obviously, some things that are like a completely different shape isn't gonna work, but if it's like a bodice or a skirt or basic sleeves, I can just use the one that fits me because I already fitted it to myself. So I highly recommend picking up one of those. They're really, really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have like a good resource, of like how to adjust sewing machine tension? It's something I've never really seemed to have gotten very well.
They're very finicky. A lot of it is just what fabric you're using can really make a huge difference. Experiment a lot. If you're consistently having huge tension problems, you may need to have your machine serviced. Ideally, we should have our machine serviced like once a year at least. I don't usually. I'm very bad about that. Depending on how much you use it. But make sure you're using fresh needles, high quality thread, like you don't want the cheap thread. And some fabrics are just a nightmare for tension. So you may need to use stabilizers or tissue paper to keep from skipping stitches, things like that. Personally, I use sewing machines, but I'm not a sewing machine expert, even though I'm dressed as a sewing machine. Honestly, when I first started cosplaying, I hand sewed everything because I was afraid of sewing machines. I didn't understand why they would screw up, so I just avoided it. And then I got a job where I had to use industrial sewing machines, and I just got thrown in the pool. So I'm okay on them, but there's a lot of times where it's basically just, it has screwed up. I don't know why it's screwing up. I will just rethread it 15 times until it works. And that usually works, usually. Any more questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you said just go out and buy the best interfacing and best lacing you can afford, but what makes it the best? A lot of times the price is not the best.
A lot of the higher quality ones, especially for say fusible, the higher quality fusibles are going to have the glue dots that are visible and even. Whereas the cheap fusible interfacing, the non-woven, really bargain basement fusible interfacing, they've like sprayed the glue on, and so there's like uneven, clumpy dots of glue, and that's not going to fuse evenly, and it's going to pucker weirdly. You basically try to buy interfacing that is from a reputable brand, as opposed to no-name interfacing, because most of the brand interfacing is usually going to be a higher quality. But you don't have to shell out tons of money, but it also depends on where you're using it, and how much stress it's going to be under. If it's for something like a small collar, you can get away with using a cheaper interfacing because it's not going to be pulling in a lot of places, and there's not as much risk of the interfacing coming off. If you're using on a jacket front, for example, you want a really high quality interfacing.
Question,
Yeah.
you're attaching those giant snaps to the EVA foam. Is it with an adhesive or does that?
Yeah, what I would do for that is sew the giant snap to a piece of fabric and then glue the fabric to the EVA foam. Because that's going to hold a lot better. And same with Warbler or any other armor piece. You want to sew the snap to the fabric and then glue the fabric because you're going to get a better bond between the fabric and the foam or the Warbler than just the metal of the snap. Anything else? Oh, yeah?
What websites do you buy fabric from?
There's, what is that, Fabric Discount Direct, or, there's a good one. Sorry?
Fabric wholesale?
Yes, that's the one, Fabric Wholesale Direct. They have really good prices. For silk, I recommend Silk Baron. They are the best. They're not super cheap, but they have all of the colors, and they're beautiful. What? They're having a scrap sale this weekend. I'm trying to think of who else I buy from. I buy a lot of fabric on Etsy, actually. We have a decent fabric district in Toronto, so I buy as much as I can locally just to avoid shipping, because shipping to Canada sucks. But for things that I can't find locally, I do usually buy a lot of things on Etsy. For you guys, it's a little bit easier because most places will send you swatches for very cheap. So if you are worried about dropping a whole lot of money on a fabric and you're not sure if it's going to work, just pay like a couple dollars and get a swatch just so you can test it before you pay the like $70 for a couple of yards. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to my TED Talk. And if you guys have any other questions, or if you want to pick my brain or need help with anything, you can hit me up on Instagram or Facebook. It's Sarcasm-himé, and I am happy to help.